I had the black pieces in this 5-minute blitz game. It's a queen's pawn opening. We transposed into a queen's gambit declined here. I've been studying this recently. Knight to c3, bishop e7, normal moves, bishop g5, h6, and now here the most popular move is bishop to h4, and we can get into the Lasker defense, the Tartakover defense, the orthodox line, so a lot of ways to play after bishop h4. But my opponent took the knight on f6, another playable move, and I think the point is White's pawn is going to come to e3, and he's trading off his bad bishop because his central pawns are on the same colored squares. So I took back with my bishop, but then he goes into an exchange variation after this. I'm not sure that's the best plan, but it's fine. It seems okay. He takes d5, releases this bishop, and I know I'm not in a normal exchange variation here because we traded the bishop for the knight, but studying the exchange variation recently gives me some ideas and some knowledge about this type of position, and it paid off. My opponent played e3, and I know I should get this bishop out to f5, which is a strong square for that bishop, but I cannot do it now because of the move queen to b3, which would fork the d5 and the b7 pawns. So to prepare that, I played c6, guarding the d5 pawn. Now I really am threatening to post the bishop on f5. So White should try to stop that, probably by playing bishop to d3 or queen to c2 to take control of that diagonal. But my opponent played a weaker move, bishop to e2. It's too passive, and it allows me to play my bishop to the ideal square. So I've completely equalized by now, at least. I like having the bishop pair, so I prefer black. White does have the option of the minority attack, though, on the queen side. So let's see how this turns out. b4, he starts his pawns rolling. So if you don't know about the minority attack, White's objective here is to push his minority of pawns and possibly take on c6, and if I recapture with the b pawn, I'll have a weak backward c pawn that can be attacked by White. So I have to do something about that, and I came up with a plan for how to deal with this minority attack. I start by slowing it down with a6 so the pawn can't be pushed yet without losing it. White castles, I castle, queen to b3, knight d7 just developing, but I also have an eye towards putting this knight all the way here on the c4 square, blocking any attack on a weak backward c pawn. That's my plan for dealing with this minority attack. a4, which supports the pawn push to b5 so this attack can continue. But then I stop it with b5, which does give me this backward c pawn, but on my terms. If these pawns get traded off, my pawn structure will be solid here if this knight can get to c4 and block any action by a rook. Rook fd1, knight to b6 headed for c4, h3, queen e7. I've got time here. There's nothing threatening my backward c pawn yet. Knight d2, now knight c4. And I'm not worried about an exchange with either minor piece here on c4. If that exchange takes place, I think b takes c4 is a perfectly solid pawn structure here, and I avoid that weak backward c pawn. My opponent moves his knight back to f1, maybe a little passive, but he is headed for g3 to attack my bishop. Rook fb8, putting it in line with his queen, maybe threatening to trade a pawn here, open up the b file. A takes b5, A takes b5. So now we have an open a file. Okay, bishop f3. Looking at that kind of brick wall there, so I'm not sure about that move. But there's not too much to be done with this bishop. Maybe it could have traded itself off for the knight. I'm not sure. G5. Not too sure about that move either that I played, but I can tuck my bishop behind that pawn. Maybe I have plans to push it later to G4. It can't go there now, of course. So I can't remember why I played G5. But now my opponent plays just a desperate move and throws away the game. Okay. It wasn't time for desperation. I think I have the slightly better position. I have this very strong knight blocking any attack on my weak c-pawn. I have the bishop pair. I'm better developed. My pieces look better. But that doesn't call for this sacrifice. Knight takes d5. He's trying to break down my pawn structure here and make my knight on c4 more precarious, but it's not worth trading a piece for 2 pawns in order to do that. So after that sequence, I trade rooks, and then I play knight to b6. I don't want to leave it there and have my opponent capture twice and win a pawn. I decide to attack his bishop, and I'm just a piece up for a couple pawns. Or actually, yeah, just 1 pawn, I think. No, 2 pawns. So piece for 2 pawns. So he retreats his bishop back to f3. Bishop to g7. Not too sure about that move either. Knight to g3 attacks my bishop. So I drop it back to g6. Rook d1 gets behind his passed pawn. I guess his only hope is to push these pawns. Maybe his e-pawn can support his d-pawn. But bishop to f8, yeah, that was the idea here. My bishop on f6 isn't doing anything looking at this pawn. So I need to get it on a better square, and I decided to put it on this diagonal. I wanted to target the b4 pawn in this position. So I maneuver it back to g7, and then after he attacks my bishop and I retreat it and he moves his rook, then I put it on f8. So now I'm attacking this pawn here, and the only way he can defend it is passively by putting his rook on b1, which he doesn't do. He pushes his pawn to e4, and then I take the pawn. And we exchange. He plays d5. I don't think he's going anywhere with these central pawns, especially after knight to c4. I have this square controlled twice by my minor pieces, and my knight is also controlling e5. So I have these dark squares under my control. Okay, knight to e2. Attack the e-pawn here with my rook. He moves his knight right back to defend it. That's the only way to defend it. So I attack it again with my knight, and he can't push his pawn forward because it'll get taken by my rook. This knight also, by the way, guards my b-pawn, so if he attacks my bishop, I can safely move it out of the way, which he does. Only other move he probably could have considered was guarding his e-pawn from behind, but he attacks the bishop. I put it on c3, knight to f5 here, and I could take this pawn, but he did just attack that pawn. So I figure I'm just going to trade. Everything's under control at this point. I wanted to trade with my bishop, not my knight, because my knight is guarding my b-pawn. So I'm a piece up. His passed pawn is blockaded. This pawn is weak. This pawn is about to go to b4, and I have a nice solid bishop and pawn structure. So I figured there's nothing he can do. I can play as slowly as I like. I do push b4, g4 to guard his f5 pawn, knight to e4, king comes up, knight to d2 to attack his rook, and I've got all 3 of these squares under my control, so my pawn is about to queen. He moves his rook to d1, I play b3, and before I get a chance to queen, his time runs out. Okay, so I was pretty happy with that game, and it resembled a traditional exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit declined, and it paid to study that line. Thanks for watching the video.